He pushed her from the balcony to silence her forever. But he didn't know about the ghost who loved her. The most arrogant man in the city just made his one mistake. He hurt the woman I loved.
The air in the back room of the Viridian Club was thick with the scent of expensive cigar smoke and fear. It was a carefully curated atmosphere, one Lysander the Kingfisher Moretti had cultivated over a decade. He sat, a statue in a bespoke charcoal suit, his fingers steepled under his chin. The only light came from a single brass lamp on the vast mahogany desk, carving his sharp features out of the darkness, leaving his eyes as pits of obsidian. Before him, a man named Ricci sweated through his cheap silk shirt, his words tumbling over each other in a frantic, pleading rhythm. "It was a mistake, Mr. Moretti, a simple error in accounting. The vig, it'll be paid by week's end, I swear on my mother's." Lysander lifted a single finger. Silence fell, instantaneous and absolute. The two large men flanking Ricci took a subtle step closer. "Your mother is a pious woman, Angelo." Lysander's voice was a low murmur, devoid of anger or heat, yet it carried the weight of a tombstone. It was the sound of verdicts, not arguments. "Do not drag her name into your failures. The money was not yours to misplace. It belongs to the people who trusted you to move it. That trust is the only currency that matters here. You have devalued it." He leaned forward, the light finally catching his eyes. They were not cruel, but profoundly, terrifyingly weary. "You have 48 hours, not a second more. The terms are unchanged, but my patience is. Do you understand the difference?" Ricci nodded, a frantic, jerky motion, tears of relief and terror welling in his eyes. He understood. The terms meant ruinous interest. Lysander's exhausted patience meant a concrete overcoat at the bottom of the harbor. The Kingfisher had spoken. The audience was over. As his men escorted the trembling Ricci out, Lysander remained seated, the silence settling back around him like dust. This was his kingdom, a realm of whispers and ledgers, of absolute power exercised in back rooms. It was monochrome, joyless. He was a ghost in his own city, a name spoken in fear, a face few could accurately describe. He ruled everything and possessed nothing. His armored town car, a silent black beast, sat idling in the evening traffic. Lysander massaged his temples, the throb of a perpetual headache brewing behind his eyes. He stared out the tinted window, watching the rain-slicked streets of the city blur into a smear of grays and muted neon. His driver, Marco, remained a silent statue in the front seat. Then, he saw her. A splash of vibrant color in the monochrome deluge. A young woman, huddled under the awning of a narrow little art supply store, laughing with the elderly vendor. She was clutching a new sketchbook to her chest as if it were a treasure, her face alight with a joy so pure it seemed to deflect the rain around her. She had a mess of auburn curls escaping from under her hood, and eyes the color of warm honey. Lysander's breath caught in his throat. It wasn't desire, not in any common sense. It was a profound, aching yearning. She was a sunbeam piercing the perpetual twilight of his existence. He watched, mesmerized, as she tucked her purchase under her coat, gave the old man a brilliant farewell smile, and dashed off down the street, a streak of life in the dying day. "Marco," he said, his voice rough, "follow that woman, discreetly." It was an impulse, a crack in his own meticulous control. For years he had moved through the world as a specter, influencing from the shadows. Now he wanted desperately to see the light up close. That single, reckless command became a ritual. Using his vast, unseen network, he learned everything about her. Her name was Sienna Quinn. She was 26, an aspiring graphic designer. She lived in a small, sun-drenched apartment above a bakery in a neighborhood his operations deliberately avoided. She loved milky, sweet coffee, hated the taste of cilantro, and spent her Saturday mornings sketching in Viridian Park. He became a ghost in her life, a patron saint of her innocent world. He would be reading a financial timesheet disguised as a newspaper at the adjacent table in her favorite cafe, The Grind. He'd catch the melody of her laugh as she debated color palettes with a friend, and something in his frozen chest would splinter. One afternoon, he was in the city museum, ostensibly examining a loaned Caravaggio, a study in violent shadows that suited his mood. His reflection was what held his attention. In the polished glass covering the painting, he watched Sienna's reflection as she stood before a vibrant Monet water lily scene. He saw the way her brow furrowed in concentration, the slight smile that played on her lips as she lost herself in the art. He was a dark silhouette superimposed over her light, a perfect metaphor for their non-existent relationship. His protection was absolute yet invisible. When a would-be pickpocket eyed her careless, unzipped bag, one of Lysander's men materialized, bumped into the thief, and with a few quiet, threatening words sent him scurrying. The petty crime rate on her block plummeted to 0. Her landlord found a mysterious grant covering her building's necessary repairs, ensuring her rent wouldn't rise. She lived in a bubble of safety, utterly unaware that its walls were built of his quiet, ruthless power. He once watched her from his car as she fumbled for her wallet at a small bookstore. She looked crestfallen, realizing she'd left her card at home. Lysander spoke a single word into his phone. Moments later, the flustered cashier informed her that her tab had been mysteriously covered, with a generous tip left in her name. "Must be a secret admirer," the cashier giggled. Sienna had blushed, a beautiful, confused pink, and laughed it off. Lysander had looked away, the shame and longing of physical pain in his gut. He was her secret admirer, a king who could gift her anything except the one thing that mattered, himself. This quiet, distant fantasy sustained him for months. It was a secret garden in the desert of his life. Then, the winter came. He saw them outside the opera house. Sienna, glowing in an emerald green dress, her arm linked with that of a handsome, impeccably dressed man, Quade. Lysander knew the name. The rising CFO of a sleek tech firm, a man often photographed at charity galas and on the society pages. The type of man who belonged in the light with someone like Sienna. Lysander watched from the shadows across the street, the cold seeping through his overcoat and into his bones. Asher was everything he was not: polished, public, acceptable. He saw Asher lean down, whisper something in Sienna's ear that made her throw her head back and laugh, that glorious, unburdened laugh. The sound, which had once been a balm, now felt like a shard of glass in his heart. His trained eye, accustomed to seeing the tells of liars and thieves, caught something else. As Asher helped Sienna into a waiting town car, his charming smile never wavered for the cameras, but his eyes, for one fleeting second, swept over the crowd with a cold, proprietary calculation. It was the look of a man surveying assets, not sharing a moment with a lover. A shard of ice formed in Lysander's gut, but then it was gone, replaced by the perfect picture of devotion. He retreated. The fantasy was over. The sunbeam had found its rightful place in the sky, and his shadows had no business reaching for it. He threw himself deeper into his work, the monochrome of his world deepening into an impenetrable black. He had the final, cruel confirmation weeks later, a society column headline on a tablet held by a subordinate: Tech wunderkind Asher Quade and artist Sienna Quinn, engaged. The accompanying photo showed her, her left hand held up, a massive diamond glittering, her smile radiant. Asher's arm was around her, his smile perfect. Lysander dismissed the man with a wave of his hand. He walked to the floor-to-ceiling window of his penthouse office, looking out over the city he commanded. He felt a profound emptiness, a desolation more complete than any he had ever known. She was happy, she was safe. She was loved by a man who could give her a life in the sun, far from the bloody foundations of his own empire. He made a vow to himself then, a final, painful act of love. He would erase himself from her story completely. He would be the ghost he was always meant to be. He would ensure her safety from an even greater distance, and he would never, ever look for her again. For 8 months he kept his vow. He buried the memory of her laugh, her smile, the way she looked at a Monet, under layers of brutal business and cold isolation. He almost convinced himself he had forgotten the color of her eyes. The call came on a Tuesday evening. One of his lieutenants had been caught in a territorial dispute, taking a bullet in the shoulder. Standard business. Lysander made a point of visiting wounded men. It fostered a loyalty that money could not buy. The hospital was one of the city's best, a place where discreet, cash-only payments ensured no questions were asked about certain types of injuries. He owned a silent, majority stake. He was walking down the sterile, quiet hallway, flanked by 2 of his men, discussing the retaliation, when the emergency doors at the far end burst open. The frantic energy of a trauma team erupted into the corridor. "Blunt force trauma, BP is crashing," a doctor yelled, running alongside a gurney. Lysander absently stepped aside to let them pass, his mind still on logistics of power and punishment. His gaze flickered over the form on the gurney as it rushed past, and his world stopped. A pale, bloodied hand hung limply over the side. Auburn curls, matted with dark, crimson blood, splayed across the pillow. The face was a mess of bruises and deep lacerations, but he knew it. He would know it in the dark, in the depths of hell itself. It was Sienna. The sunshine had been extinguished. The vibrant woman who laughed in the rain was broken, lifeless, drenched in her own blood. The most powerful man in the city stood utterly paralyzed, the air punched from his lungs. The calculated, controlled Kingfisher was gone. In his place was a raw, terrified man, staring into the abyss at the one thing he never thought he'd see, the end of her light. The world narrowed to the sight of her broken form receding down the hallway. The frantic beep of the heart monitor attached to her gurney was a dagger in his ear, each chirp a countdown to a horror he could not allow. The Kingfisher, the man who commanded armies of shadows, stood frozen, his vast power rendered meaningless. Then, the ice in his veins shattered, replaced by a fire so furious it was blinding. He moved. "Marco!" His voice wasn't a murmur anymore, it was a crack of thunder in the sterile hallway. His driver was at his side in an instant. "That woman is Sienna Quinn. She does not die. Do you understand? She does not die." He didn't wait for a response. He stalked after the trauma team, a force of nature in a tailored suit, his 2 bodyguards struggling to keep up. He burst through the swinging doors of the emergency bay, ignoring the protests of a young nurse. "Who is in charge here?" he demanded, his gaze fixed on Sienna's still form as doctors and nurses swarmed her, cutting away her blood-soaked clothes. A harried-looking surgeon looked up, annoyance flashing across his face. "Sir, you need to leave." Lysander's man Silas was there in a second, his bulk looming over the doctor. He didn't touch him, didn't speak. He simply placed a business card on the instrument tray. It was blank except for a single embossed image, a kingfisher in flight. The surgeon's face drained of all color. He knew. Everyone in this hospital who needed to know knew. Lysander stepped closer, his voice dropping back to that terrifying, calm register. "You will save her. You will use every resource in this building, and then you will use resources that are not in this building." He pulled out his phone, not breaking eye contact. "I am having the world's leading neurosurgeons, Dr. Evangeline Ross from Baltimore and Dr. Henrik Vogel from Zurich, on a private jet within the hour. They will be here by morning. You will confer with them. You will follow their lead. Money is not an object, it is a tool, and I possess every tool." He turned his gaze back to Sienna. A nurse was intubating her, the tube snaking into her mouth like a violation. A sound, something between a growl and a sob, escaped him. He reached out, his hand hovering inches from her blood-caked hair, unable to touch her. "Save her," he whispered, the words a vow, a prayer, a curse. He owned a facility. It wasn't a hospital. It was a medical fortress called Haven, a state-of-the-art clinic for the ultra-rich and discreet, nestled on a private, heavily guarded estate north of the city. Before the sun rose, Sienna was transferred there via a private medical helicopter, Lysander watching her every second, his face a mask of grim stone. He placed his most trusted men at her door, and then did the unthinkable. He stayed. The ghost emerged from the shadows, taking up residence in an armchair in the corner of her room. He had a tablet, a phone, a laptop. He ran his empire from that chair, his voice a low, continuous murmur issuing orders for mergers, acquisitions, and brutal retaliations, all while his eyes never left the woman in the bed. The contrast was surreal. Discussions of life and death on the streets happening in the same breath as a silent vigil for a single, fragile life. Days bled into one another. The world-renowned surgeons had done their work, mending the shattered skull, relieving the swelling on her brain. They had repaired a ruptured spleen, set broken bones. The body, they said, would heal. The mind was another matter. When Sienna finally woke, it was not a gentle awakening. It was a frantic, gasping emergence into terror. Her eyes, those warm honey pools, flew open, wide with blind panic. She tried to scream against the tube in her throat, her body thrashing weakly against the restraints they'd been forced to use. Lysander was at her side in an instant, his hand hovering again, desperate to calm but terrified to touch. "You're safe," he said, his voice softer than it had been in a decade. "You're safe. The tube is helping you breathe. You're in a hospital. You're safe." But she didn't see a protector. She saw a tall, intimidatingly handsome stranger with eyes full of a stormy, frightening intensity. She saw a man who looked like he could break the world. She didn't see the vulnerability in his gaze, only the power. She flinched away from him, a weak, pathetic movement that shattered what was left of his heart. The tube was removed when she could breathe on her own, but the silence remained. She didn't speak. She barely ate. She would lie there, staring at the ceiling, her eyes empty. The vibrant woman was gone, replaced by a hollowed-out shell. The sunshine had been extinguished, and in its place was a profound, silent fear that permeated the room. She would watch him, this silent sentinel in the corner, with a look of pure, unadulterated terror. He couldn't bear it. His presence, the very thing he'd intended as protection, was harming her. He was a monster in her nightmare, confirming her fear. He felt a desperation more profound than any he'd ever faced in a corporate takeover or a turf war. He needed to build a bridge to her, and he had no tools, no language for such a thing. His entire life had been built on taking, on commanding, on instilling fear. Now he needed to give, to ask, to provide comfort. There was only one person in the world who could possibly help. The one person he had no right to ask. He stepped out into the hall, his phone feeling like a lead weight in his hand. He scrolled through his contacts, past enforcers and politicians, until he found the name he hadn't dialed in 3 years. Dr. Isadora Moretti. He pressed call. It rang 4 times, and he was about to hang up, cowardice seizing him when she answered. Lysander. Her voice was cool, professional, devoid of any sisterly warmth. It was the tone she might use with a telemarketer. This is a surprise. Isa, he began, his voice rough with disuse. I need your help. A bitter, quiet laugh echoed down the line. Let me guess, one of your thugs is having nightmares? Suffering from a moral injury after breaking a man's knees? I don't work for you, Lysander. I haven't since you chose your empire over your family, since you weren't there when our mother died. The words were a physical blow. He leaned against the cold wall, closing his eyes. It's not for me, and it's not one of my men. He took a shaky breath. It's a woman. She's been brutally attacked. Thrown from a balcony. She's alive, but she's broken. She doesn't speak. She's terrified. Of everything. Of me. There was a long silence on the other end. He could almost hear her clinical curiosity warring with her deep-seated resentment. Why call me? There are thousands of qualified therapists. Because you're the best, he said, the admission costing him. And because she's innocent, Isa. She's light, and someone tried to snuff it out. I can't reach her. I'm making it worse. Another pause. Who is she to you? The million-dollar question. He looked through the glass window into Sienna's room, at the fragile figure in the bed. She's everything, he whispered, the truth ripped from him. She is everything I am not, and someone broke her because of it. Please. The raw vulnerability in his voice, so utterly foreign, must have been what convinced her. He heard a soft sigh. Text me the address. I'll be there in 2 hours. This isn't for you, it's for her. Thank you, he breathed. Don't thank me, we are not reconciled. Dr. Isadora Moretti arrived exactly on time, every inch the renowned professional in a sharp pantsuit, her dark hair pulled back in a severe bun. Her eyes, the same shade as her brother's but without the weary shadows, took in the opulent clinic, the armed guards, with a barely concealed disdain. She offered Lysander a curt nod, no more. But when she entered Sienna's room, her entire demeanor changed. The ice melted, replaced by a warm, calm empathy. She pulled up a chair, not too close, and sat quietly for a moment, just observing. Sienna? She said, her voice a gentle, melodic contrast to Lysander's gravelly murmur. My name is Isadora. I'm a doctor, but not that kind. I'm here to help with the parts that don't show up on an X-ray. Sienna's fearful eyes flickered toward her, then back to the ceiling. It's okay to be scared, Isadora continued. It's okay to not talk. We can just sit here. You're safe here. No one will hurt you. The man outside? Lysander. He can be very intimidating, but his only job right now is to make sure you are safe. He's very good at that job. Slowly, over the next few days, Isadora built a bridge of trust. She talked about mundane things, about art, about the weather. She brought in scented lotions and offered to massage Sienna's hands, stiff from inactivity. She never pushed. She was a steady, calm presence in the storm of Sienna's trauma. Lysander watched from the hallway, a ghost again, but now by necessity. He saw his sister's skill, the way Sienna's body slowly unclenched in her presence. A painful mix of gratitude and envy twisted in his gut. One afternoon he watched through the window as Isadora sat, sketching idly in a notebook. Sienna's eyes were fixed on the moving pencil, Isadora noticed. She didn't say anything. She just gently placed the notebook and pencil on the bedside table. An hour later, after Isadora had left, Lysander slipped in to bring Sienna a fresh glass of water. He stopped short. On the notebook, in shaky childlike letters, was a single word. Asher. The name was a spark to the tinderbox of his rage. He forced his expression to remain neutral, placing the water down. Your fiancé? He asked, his voice carefully soft. Sienna's eyes filled with tears. She gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. Then her hand trembled, and she pointed a weak finger at the word. Then she made a violent slashing motion across her own throat. The ice flooded back into Lysander's veins. This was no random attack, this was personal. The next day, during her session with Isadora, the dam broke. Lysander, standing his silent vigil in the hall, heard a raw, guttural sob from Sienna, the first real sound she'd made since waking. He tensed, ready to burst in, but Isadora caught his eye through the window and gave a sharp, subtle shake of her head. Stay. He listened, his heart pounding against his ribs, as the story spilled out in choked, fractured sentences. She had loved Asher. She had loved his charm, his ambition, the perfect future he painted for them. She'd been working on a design project for his company's anniversary party, and he'd given her his old tablet to use for its larger screen. She'd found files, not just files, hidden ledgers, offshore account numbers, correspondence with entities she recognized from news reports about industrial espionage. He wasn't just embezzling, he was selling corporate secrets, laundering money for a powerful, shadowy consortium, the Carthage Group. Her voice grew stronger, laced with a fury that had been buried under the fear. I confronted him. I was so stupid. I thought he could explain that it was a mistake. She described the way his smile had vanished, the charming facade melting away to reveal something cold and reptilian underneath. He'd called her a liability, a loose end. He was so calm, she whispered, the horror fresh in her voice. He said no one would question it. A young, struggling artist, overwhelmed by the pressure of her engagement, a tragic suicide. Her breath hitched. He dragged me to the balcony. I fought. I scratched him, but he was so strong. He didn't yell. He just said goodbye, Sienna. And then he pushed me. The silence in the room after her confession was heavier than any before. Isadora held her hand, offering a steady anchor. Lysander stood in the hallway, his fists clenched so tightly his nails drew blood from his palms. The image was seared into his mind. Asher Quade, the polished wolf, coldly executing the woman he claimed to love. It was not a crime of passion. It was a boardroom decision. She was a problem to be eliminated. The protective fire that had awakened in him the night she was brought in, now transformed into something colder, harder, more lethal. This was no longer just about healing. It was about justice. It was about revenge. He waited until Isadora emerged from the room, her face pale but composed. She looked at her brother, and for the first time in years, he saw something other than resentment in her eyes. He saw a shared, grim understanding. "You heard?" she asked quietly. "Every word. What are you going to do?" Lysander looked back through the window at Sienna, who had cried herself into an exhausted sleep. The tears had cleansed something. The hollow fear in her face had been replaced by a weary but definite anguish. "I am going to do what I do best, Isa," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "I am going to break him, but not with a bullet." He tried to silence her story. "I am going to make sure the whole world hears it." The truth, laid bare between them, became the anvil upon which their new relationship was forged. The silent, intimidating presence in the corner of her room was gone. In its place was Lysander, the man. He was there, not as a sentinel, but as a participant in her healing. He began with small, tangible things. When the physical therapists came to help her walk again, he was there. Not hovering, but offering a steadying arm when she wobbled, his strong, capable hands a gentle guide. His touch, which once made her flinch, became a source of unshakable stability. He didn't speak platitudes. He spoke quiet, firm encouragement. "Again," he'd say, his voice low. "You can do it. One more step." He started talking to her, not about the weather or art, but about himself. Edited, sanitized fragments of a life. He told her about his mother's love for opera, how she'd play recordings on a scratchy old player every Sunday morning. He confessed a secret fondness for Byzantine poetry, for the intricate, ordered beauty of its metaphors. He brought her books from his personal library, their pages filled with his own marginal notes in a precise, sharp script. She saw the mind behind the menace, a man of depth and quiet passion who appreciated beauty, even if his own life was steeped in ugliness. Sienna, in turn, began to emerge from her shell. The hollow fear was replaced by a determined, if weary, resilience. She was no damsel, she was a survivor. She asked him questions, her voice growing stronger each day. She asked about his work, and he gave her vague, truthful answers about import, export, and asset management, which made her smile a little, the first ghost of the sun he'd seen in months. Their bond was built in the quiet hours of the night when the pain kept her awake. He would read to her, his voice a low, calming rumble that pushed back the nightmares. They were two wounded creatures, one of the body and spirit, the other of the soul, finding an unexpected solace in each other's company. She saw the profound loneliness in him, the weight of the crown he never wanted. He saw the incredible strength in her, the unextinguishable spark of light that had survived the fall. One evening, a month after her confession, she took her first unassisted steps across the room. She was aiming for the window, for the view of the sunset he told her was spectacular. Her legs trembled, but her jaw was set. She made it halfway before her strength gave out. He was there in an instant, catching her as she fell, his arms wrapping around her, holding her upright against his chest. For a moment they stayed like that, breathing in sync. She was warm and alive in his arms, her head tucked under his chin. He could feel the frantic beat of her heart against his own. It was the closest he had ever been to her, and it felt like coming home to a place he never knew existed. "Lysander," she whispered into his shirt. "I'm here." he murmured, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. She leaned back, just enough to look up at him. The fading sunset light caught in her eyes, and he saw it there, not pity, not fear, but a deep, unwavering trust. It was the most precious thing he had ever been given. It was in that moment he knew he had to tell her everything. He could not build anything with her on a foundation of half-truths. He had to offer her all his shadows and let her decide if she still wanted to stand in the light with him. Gently he helped her to the armchair by the window, kneeling before her so they were at eye level. The city below was lighting up, a kingdom of twinkling stars at his feet, and he was about to risk losing the only thing in it that mattered. "Sienna," he began, his voice gravelly with nerves. "There is more you need to know, about me." And he told her. He told her about the silent admiration, the crossed paths in the cafe and the museum, the anonymous tips, the invisible shield of protection. He told her about the heartbreak of seeing her with Asher, the engagement announcement that made him retreat. He laid bare his quiet, lonely obsession. Then he told her the rest. He didn't soften the words. "They call me the Kingfisher," he said, watching her face closely. "I run this city, Sienna, not the mayor, not the police commissioner. Me. My business is not legal. It is built on violence and fear. I am not a good man. I have done terrible things." He took a shaky breath, the admission costing him more than any business deal ever had. "My world is built on shadows, but every bit of light I have left in me has always belonged to you. I emerged from those shadows to save you, and I will spend every day of my life protecting you if you'll let me." He fell silent, waiting for the terror to return to her eyes, for her to recoil from the monster he had confessed to being. Sienna listened, her expression unreadable. She looked at him, really looked at him. She saw the ruthless kingpin, yes, but she also saw the man who read poetry. She saw the weary eyes that carried the weight of an empire, but also the vulnerability in them now, laid bare for her judgment. She saw a man who loved her enough to let her go when he thought she was happy, and brave enough to step into the light to save her when she was not. She reached out, her hand still slightly weak, and placed it over his. Her touch was warm and steady. "You showed me your shadows," she said, her voice clear and strong. "Now let me show you the sun." It was an acceptance, a choice. She was choosing to see the man within the monster. The relief that washed over him was so profound it left him dizzy. He bowed his head, pressing his forehead to their joined hands, a silent vow of devotion. The next morning, the dynamic in the room shifted entirely. The healing continued, but now it was fused with a new purpose, planning. "I want to know everything," Sienna said, her design tablet now repurposed for notes. "What is your plan for him?" Lysander smiled, a cold, terrifying thing that was all Kingfisher. "Killing him is too simple. It's what he expects from a man like me. A bullet is quick. I want him to suffer. I want to systematically dismantle every single thing he has built, everything he covets. His wealth, his reputation, his freedom. I want to expose the Carthage group and make them destroy their own puppet. They tried to silence you. Now you will stand beside me, and you will be their ruin. They will look at you, alive and triumphant, and know they failed." The plan was a masterpiece of cruel irony. Lysander, the criminal kingpin, would use his network not for violence, but for information. He had his hackers, the best money could buy, dive deep into Asher's digital life. They founded all the embezzled funds, the secret accounts, the encrypted communications with Carthage. Lysander moved like a chess master. He anonymously leaked the financial crimes to a hungry financial journalist, triggering a massive sell-off of Asher's company's stock. He orchestrated a cascade of bad press, whispering doubts into the right ears at exclusive clubs. He had the evidence of industrial espionage delivered to the authorities, but timed it perfectly. The final move was his piece de resistance. The Carthage group was hosting its annual charity gala, a monstrous display of old money opulence. Attendance was mandatory for anyone who mattered. Asher, though his reputation was fraying, would be there, desperate to show strength and secure his backing. Lysander ensured to RSVP for both of them. "We're going," he told Sienna. She didn't hesitate. She nodded, a fierce light in her eyes. "What should I wear?" The night of the gala arrived. The event was held at the city's art museum, in the very wing where Lysander had once watched Sienna's reflection. The irony was not lost on him. Inside, the cream of society mingled, champagne flutes glittering under the crystal chandeliers. The air was thick with perfume and whispered gossip about Asher Quade's sudden fall from grace. Asher himself was there, impeccably dressed, but with a strained, desperate look in his eyes, clinging to the inner circle of Carthage elders who were already starting to distance themselves. Then, the whispers stopped. The crowd near the entrance fell silent, parting like the Red Sea. Lysander, the Kingfisher, Moretti stood in the doorway. He was a vision of terrifying power in a tailored black tuxedo, his ice-cold gaze sweeping the room. But it was not he who held everyone's attention, it was the woman on his arm. Sienna stood beside him, radiant in a gown of deep crimson that seemed to defy the darkness that had tried to claim her. Her auburn hair was swept up, revealing the elegant line of her neck, strong and unbroken. She stood tall, her posture perfect, her eyes not downcast but blazing with a fierce, unbreakable resolve. The woman they had all read about, the tragic fiancé who had supposedly jumped to her death, was alive, and she was staring directly at Quade. A wave of gasps rippled through the ballroom. Cameras flashed, not with permission, capturing the impossible image. Asher's face went from pale to ashen. His champagne flute slipped from his fingers, shattering on the marble floor. The calculated coolness he was known for evaporated, replaced by sheer, unadulterated panic. He saw his ruin standing before him, alive and more vibrant than ever. "It's a trick!" he screamed, his voice cracking, pointing a trembling finger at Lysander. "He's behind this. He's coerced her. That man is Lysander Moretti. He's the Kingfisher, a crime lord. He's forcing her to do this." The crowd recoiled, the name Kingfisher spreading through them like a shockwave. Lysander didn't move. He simply smiled that small, cold smile. He gave a barely perceptible nod. All around the ballroom, on the large screens that had been displaying silent auctions and donor lists, the images changed. Instead of numbers, they showed Quade's face, slick with sweat as he looked panicked. Then a video played. It was a recording. Sienna's voice, shaky but clear, came through the speakers. "I confronted him. He called me a liability, a tragic suicide. Goodbye, Sienna." The room was utterly silent, except for the damning recording. It played out the entire confession, Sienna's story of discovery and betrayal, her voice gaining strength as she described his cold-eyed execution attempt. Asher stood frozen, a rabbit in the spotlight. He looked to the Carthage elders, but they turned their backs on him, their faces stony. He had become the liability. On cue, the police moved in. They weren't Lysander's men. They were real detectives, the ones who had received the anonymous package of evidence hours before. They cuffed Asher, reading him his rights as he screamed and struggled, his perfect life dissolving into a very public nightmare. He wasn't taken out by a rival's bullet. He was taken away in handcuffs, his name synonymous with betrayal and cowardice, utterly and completely destroyed. Lysander turned to Sienna. The fierce mask of the Kingfisher melted away, leaving only the man who loved her. "It's done," he said softly. She looked from Asher's retreating, broken form back to Lysander. The blaze of revenge in her eyes softened, but the strength remained. She took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "No," she said, "it's just beginning." They walked out of the ballroom together, past the stunned, silent crowd, under the grand archways, and into the cool night air. The press swarmed, but his men created a path. He helped her into the waiting car, and they drove away from the ruin of Quade. He expected her to be quiet, to process the enormity of what had just happened. Instead, she looked out the window at the city lights, a small, genuine smile touching her lips. "He looked at me," she said almost to herself. "In that moment before they took him away, he looked right at me, and he was terrified, not of you, of me." She turned to Lysander. "Thank you for not taking that from me." He simply nodded, understanding. He had given her back her power, not just her safety. They arrived back at the estate. He walked her to the door of her room, a sudden uncertainty gripping him. The mission was over. The revenge was complete. Would she still want him now that the adrenaline had faded? "Lysander," she said, stopping him as he turned to leave. "I'm not afraid of your shadows anymore." She stood on her toes, her body still healing but her spirit whole, and kissed him. It was not a kiss of gratitude or passion born of heightened emotion. It was a kiss of choice, of promise. Weeks turned into months. The story dominated the news cycles before eventually fading. The Carthage group, severely weakened, retreated from the city to lick its wounds. Quade awaited trial, his life in ruins. Lysander and Sienna built their new empire not on fear but on something far stronger. He began the slow, arduous process of legitimizing his businesses, with Sienna's sharp eye and ethical compass guiding him. She started her own design firm, her work infused with a new depth and strength she'd found in the fire. One evening, they stood on the balcony of his penthouse, the same balcony he'd stood on the night he'd seen her engagement announcement. The city sprawled before them, a tapestry of light and shadow. Sienna leaned against him, his arms wrapped around her. "You know," she said softly, "I used to think the city was so gray, but you taught me that the shadows are what make the light mean something." He rested his chin on her head, breathing in the scent of her hair. The Kingfisher, the ghost, the man of immense quiet power, had finally found his home. Not in a kingdom of fear, but in the unwavering light of a sunbeam who had chosen to love all of him, shadows and all. Together, they watched the dawn break over the skyline, painting the world in brilliant, hopeful color. Enjoyed the story? Like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss the next one.